The fulfillment of one desire might lead to one being forced to compromise countless other desires. Now, when sex just becomes this cheap thing that's no longer sacred, then yes, you might be able to fulfill your desires, but you are going to be robbing the children that are born as a result of fulfilling theirs. Just because a very, very small percentage of the population may suffer from gender dysphoria, in order to cater to their desires, now the majority of the population, who naturally and instinctively understand whether or not they're a boy or a girl, are put into these situations where they're confused, where they're pressured to choose a different gender. And even people with gender dysphoria, instead of helping them, they are encouraged to undergo treatment, which many of them later in life regret. Homosexual men disproportionately have more STDs. So by fulfilling one desire that they have, leads to having to give up other desires such as not having these STDs that cause them pain and can potentially kill them. Like I said, people can fulfill their desires, but there are consequences to fulfilling your desires. And oftentimes those consequences lead to the sacrifice of many other desires. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome all viewers. Today I want to talk about the underlying philosophy and implications of these movements that we see being propagated today. So for example, the LGBT agenda is one that I frequently discuss on this channel because number one, it's my duty to do so as somebody who teaches about the truth, about Islam. But I also focus on it because it is being pushed so hard, and it is specifically having a huge effect on today's youth. And one of the reasons it's able to spread so quickly is because there is a lot of false language that is used to promote it. This agenda is being forced on people under the guise of love and freedom. And at face value, who can argue against love and freedom? But if we open our minds and we think a bit deeply about this topic, we'll find that love has very little to do with this movement, and freedom isn't really exactly what they're trying to portray it as. So to understand what's going on, you have to get to the very core of the underlying philosophy of these movements. These are, in fact, religious movements. Allah tells us in the Quran, "Have you seen him who takes his own lust, his own vain desires, as his God?" And they want everyone else to also worship this God of theirs. But rather than even start off arguing from a religious perspective, let's just think rationally. What are the consequences of living according to your desires? Should people not have to control their desires? Well, let's start with human conception, because what is society other than a bunch of human beings? Well, the way that this world has been designed is that a male and a female, a man and a woman, they come together. And when they have intercourse, this is how human beings are created. Now, interestingly enough, this world has also been designed in a way where men and women, they have desires where they want to have that intercourse. They might want to have that intercourse and not even have a baby. That's how strong those desires are. That's how much the human being might desire for that brief period of enjoyment when a man and woman come together in that way. However, another reality of human existence is that there are consequences to one's actions. When you act upon your desires, there are certain results and repercussions. The fulfillment of one desire might lead to one being forced to compromise countless other desires. So take a woman, for example. Let's say that she fulfills that desire of having intimacy with a man, and then she gets pregnant. She is now going to have to compromise so many things that she might want to do, so many desires that she might have for the sake of her child. What about the man who impregnated her? If he's going to be a good father, he's going to have to sacrifice fulfilling his desires. He's going to have to forfeit a lot of his freedoms to take care of his child and the mother of his child. And if they don't fulfill this vital role of parenthood, then this will contribute to the destruction of society. And as simple and obvious as this example might seem, it's actually not that obvious. Because when people promote these agendas of just, hey, love is love and you should have the freedom to do whatever you want, it completely undermines and ignores this reality. But unfortunately, a lot of people, they don't want to have these conversations and think deeply. Because the second you start questioning the God of their lustful desires, they get so triggered and emotional that they'll just demonize you and cancel you. But inshallah, if you are still watching this video, you're able to follow along, then hopefully you're from those who can actually see what's going on and perhaps help convey this message, help spread the reality about what these shallow slogans really entail. And what else does it entail? Well, we already mentioned how fulfilling one desire leads people to being forced to give up many other desires. And there are countless examples we can give. We already mentioned fulfilling the desire of intimacy between a man and a woman, which leads to childbirth, and all of the desires that one has to give up in order to raise a child. But you can also take drugs, for example. Some people, they have that desire to just feel a certain high, but there's a consequence for fulfilling that desire. There are people who get high, they do drugs, and then the rest of their life falls apart. They have to compromise other desires, including not being addicted to drugs and everything that comes along with that. But there are also positive desires that one might have that also leads them to sacrifice other desires. Somebody might want to be a good student. They might want to be a good athlete. They might want to have a good career. Those might be positive desires that they have. Well, they're going to have to sacrifice a lot in order to achieve those goals. So the point is, we all have desires, but this idea that you can just fulfill all your desires and there's not going to be these real life consequences, it's make-believe. And this is why one's desires is a false god, because your desires cannot give you everything that you want. Your desires are not really in control of existence and reality. And the more you try to sacrifice on behalf of this false god, the further astray you're going to go. So take abortion, for example. People, they want to fulfill those desires without having to deal with the consequences. So in order to deal with that, there are people who just want to kill babies. Just kill them. That way I can fulfill my desire and I don't have to deal with the consequences. People are just pushing the envelope and they're trying so hard to not control those desires. To not say, hey, you know what? I have those desires, but if I fulfill them, then somebody can get pregnant and I'm not really trying to raise a child with that person. So let me just control my desires and let me try to channel those desires toward a relationship where I do want to have a child, where that child will grow up in a healthy household so that society can flourish. Instead of approaching this topic that way, they want to manipulate reality to just cater to those initial shallow cravings and inclinations. And when you have that as a foundation, your society is just going to race towards destruction because there are countless problems that are going to come as a result. So let's get back to LGBT, for example. Two things this deals with is gender and sex. So right off the bat, they're lying when they say it's about love. It's not about love. Sex and love are not the same thing. Gender and love are obviously not the same thing either. What it does have to do with, though, is one's cravings and desires. Now, when sex just becomes this cheap thing that's no longer sacred, that's no longer truly taken seriously between a husband and wife, then yes, you might be able to fulfill your desires, but you are going to be robbing the children that are born as a result of fulfilling theirs. A child naturally wants to grow up in a home with loving parents, with a loving mother and father, who sacrifice on their behalf. The mother naturally has certain instincts, certain qualities that a child yearns for, and the father does as well. But when you live in a society where people just run amok being promiscuous, all of these children are going to be robbed of that. Many of them are robbed of life in general because they're just aborted. Well, what about all of this gender fluidity stuff that's being pushed on children? Just because a very, very small percentage of the population may suffer from gender dysphoria, in order to cater to their desires, now the majority of the population, who naturally and instinctively understand whether or not they're a boy or a girl, are put into these situations where they're confused, where they're pressured to choose a different gender. And even people with gender dysphoria, instead of helping them, they are encouraged to undergo treatment, which many of them later in life regret. Like I said, people can fulfill their desires, but there are consequences to fulfilling your desires. And oftentimes those consequences lead to the sacrifice of many other desires. Now let's talk about homosexuality. Homosexual men disproportionately have more STDs. So by fulfilling one desire that they have, leads to having to give up other desires. Other desires such as not having these STDs that cause them pain and can potentially kill them. And all of these examples thus far have not even approached the topic from a perspective of the divine revelation that our Creator sent to us, the reality of this life, being held accountable in the hereafter, which is really far more important. However, I just wanted to give these examples because regardless of your beliefs about God and this life in the hereafter, these are rational, obvious proofs. And this highlights the fact that we're not having real conversations about these topics. People are just blurting out meaningless, superficial slogans that have no basis in reality. And rather than have real conversations, people want to demonize and silence anyone who questions their false god, the false god of their vain desires. Allah knows best. Thank you for watching. May Allah guide us all to the truth. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.